Keanu's row one more time, quick and nervous. Keanu was still there, still calm, still quiet, looking out the window as clouds passed under moonlight. He wasn't watching her. He wasn't thinking about punishing her. He wasn't planning anything. He was simply existing with dignity. And that dignity, simple, quiet, unshaken, was the thing that made her feel smaller than any crew warning ever could. The rest of the flight stretched ahead long and quiet. People ate. People watched movies. People rested. The woman stayed mostly silent, her anger replaced by a stiff emptiness. Keanu remained calm, his simple clothes unchanged, his posture relaxed, his patience intact. The story, however, wasn't finished. Because when a person tries to humiliate someone in public, the real ending often doesn't happen in the moment of insult. The real ending happens later, when the truth catches up, when the world responds, when someone has to face what they tried to do. And somewhere behind the cockpit door, the captain and crew continued their job, calm and steady, guiding the aircraft through the night, reminding everyone without ever saying a name that respect isn't optional at 30,000 feet and dignity doesn't need expensive clothing to be real. The first-class cabin felt like a quiet lounge floating above the busy airport. Warm ceiling lights made the leather seats look even softer, and the air smelled faintly of clean linen and coffee. People spoke in low voices, careful not to disturb the calm. A businessman adjusted his cufflinks and scrolled through emails as if the plane were already in the sky. A couple across the aisle leaned close together, whispering and smiling as they compared photos on a phone. A flight attendant moved smoothly through the aisle, offering water with a professional smile, her shoes barely making a sound on the carpet. Outside the window, the airport glowed with lines of white and amber lights, and the distant movement of luggage carts and service vehicles looked like tiny toys in the night. Everything in first class was designed to feel effortless, quiet, smooth, and expensive, like nothing unpleasant could ever reach this part of the plane. Near the window sat Keanu Reeves, and he looked like he belonged to a different world than the polished one around him. He wasn't trying to stand out, but his simple clothes did it for him anyway. His jacket was dark and plain, not the kind people wore to impress anyone. His shirt looked comfortable, like something someone might wear on a long road trip. His shoes were clean, but not shiny. He wasn't holding a luxury bag or wearing a bright watch. He didn't have sunglasses on his head or headphones that looked like they cost more than some people's rent. If anything, he looked like someone who had chosen comfort on purpose, the way a person does when they care more about peace than appearance. He sat quietly with his hands resting on his lap, shoulders relaxed, his face calm in a way that made the noisy airport outside feel far away. Keanu didn't speak much. He didn't call for attention. He didn't wave anyone over or act like he expected special treatment. When a flight attendant passed by, he gave a small nod and a gentle thank you that sounded sincere, not automatic. He looked out the window for a long moment, watching the lights blink and the ground crew move in practice patterns. To anyone watching him closely, he didn't seem worried or hurried. He seemed like a man who had learned how to wait without feeling annoyed by it. His eyes were steady and his mouth rested in a neutral expression that could have been mistaken for tiredness. But it wasn't tiredness. It was something quieter, like a person who didn't need to prove anything. Still, first class has its own silent rules, and some passengers liked those rules more than the comfort. It wasn't only about wide seats and better food. It was about the feeling that you were different from the crowd behind the curtain. It was a place where people expected certain clothes, certain brands, certain attitudes. The seat itself almost acted like a label. Some passengers carried themselves as if the cabin belonged to them personally, as if they had purchased not only comfort, but also the right to judge, who deserved to share it. And when they saw Keanu sitting there in clothes that didn't match their idea of first class, their eyes lingered a little longer than usual. A woman 2 rows ahead turned her head and looked him over quickly, then looked away as if she didn't want to be caught staring. A man across the aisle glanced down at Keanu's shoes, then up at his face, then back at his phone like he was trying to make sense of something. Someone whispered behind a magazine, and another person's soft laugh followed. None of it was loud enough to be called rude, but it wasn't kind either. It was the quiet judgment that people think doesn't count because it isn't shouted. It was the kind of judgment that hides behind polite silence. Keanu didn't react. If he noticed the looks, he didn't show it. He remained the same, calm, still, as if the cabin around him was only a background scene and not something that could touch him. He shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting the hem of his jacket, then rested his hand on the armrest. He glanced at the safety card in the seat pocket briefly, not because he didn't know it, but because it gave his mind something small and simple to focus on. It was the kind of thing people do when they just want to stay grounded. He wasn't trying to look important. He wasn't trying to make a point. He simply existed in the space with quiet ease. The boarding process continued. The curtain between first class and the rest of the plane remained open for now, and people kept walking forward, guided by flight attendants who pointed out seat numbers. The sound of rolling luggage filled the cabin in short bursts. Every few seconds, someone reached into the overhead bin, pushing a bag into place, then closing the compartment with a soft click. The cabin gradually filled with more passengers, each one carrying their own mood into the space. Some excited, some tired, some impatient. Keanu watched it all with the same calm expression, as if a person watching rain fall outside a window. It was a long flight. That much was clear from the way people prepared. Neck pillows, bottled water, expensive snacks, thick sweaters draped over arms. Some passengers already looked annoyed, as if the flight were an inconvenience they had to survive, not a service they had chosen. Others were comfortable, already slipping into the gentle softness of first class, as if it were a familiar place. Keanu didn't look annoyed or excited. He looked patient. He looked like someone who understood that time would pass either way. A flight attendant came by again and offered pre-aperture drinks. Water, juice, champagne, she asked in a warm tone. Keanu smiled politely. Water would be great. Thank you. His voice was calm, quiet, and respectful. The attendant handed him a glass and smiled a little more than usual, as if she appreciated the simple kindness. Of course, here you are, Keanu nodded again. Thanks. Then he took a small sip, set the glass down carefully, and returned his gaze to the window. Outside, the aircraft sat under bright floodlights. The airport looked busy, even at night. A plane in the distance rolled slowly toward a runway. Another aircraft's lights blinked as it turned near a terminal. The world outside felt large and loud, but inside first class, everything tried to stay soft and controlled. It was a space where people paid for peace. Yet peace is fragile when pride walks in. A new passenger entered the cabin, a woman in her late 30s or early 40s, dressed sharply, moving with the confidence of someone used to being noticed. She wore a light-colored blazer and jewelry that caught the warm cabin lights. Her hair was styled neatly, and her makeup looked perfect, as if she had stepped out of a magazine. She dragged a small designer suitcase behind her, and the sound of its wheels on the carpet seemed louder than it should have been. She didn't smile at anyone. She didn't nod politely. She looked straight ahead as if everyone around her were obstacles that should move out of her way. She paused near the front of the cabin, checked her ticket, then continued down the aisle. Her eyes moved quickly from seat to seat, scanning numbers. She looked irritated already, like the simple act of boarding was beneath her. The flight attendant offered a polite greeting. Welcome aboard. The woman gave only a short nod, barely acknowledging the staff member, and kept walking. As she moved further into first class, she noticed the cabin's details the way some people notice status, the extra space, the quiet, the softness. She inhaled as if she were breathing in proof that she belonged here. She adjusted her blazer and lifted her chin slightly, taking her place in the world like a person stepping onto a stage. Then her eyes landed on Keanu. At first, she didn't recognize him. That wasn't surprising. People often recognize famous faces only when they expect to see them. In a studio, in a movie poster, on a red carpet, yes, in a first-class seat, wearing plain clothes, maybe not. Her gaze slid over him and stopped like her mind had hit a problem. She looked at his jacket, at his shirt, at the way he sat quietly, and something in her expression tightened. It wasn't confusion. It was judgment. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she took one step closer than another. Keanu continued looking out the window, calm, unaware, or uninterested. The woman checked her ticket again, then looked at the seat number above him, then back at him. Her face hardened as if she had discovered an insult directed at her personally. She stopped at the row beside him. For a moment, she simply stood there staring. Keanu turned his head slightly, noticing movement in his peripheral vision. He glanced up with a calm expression, not startled, just aware. His eyes met hers briefly. He gave a small polite nod, the way you might acknowledge a stranger standing near you. He didn't speak first. He didn't assume anything. He waited. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked down at him as if he were sitting in her seat. Even if he was, she didn't smile back. She didn't nod. Her expression was full of irritation, like she had already decided he was a problem. Her gaze flicked to the window seat, then to the aisle seat, then back to Keanu's face. The tension in her posture made her shoulders stiff and her cleft lift higher. Keanu remained calm, his body language relaxed. He didn't lean away, but he didn't challenge her either. He simply looked at her with quiet patience. If there was anything in his expression, it was mild curiosity, like he was waiting to see what she needed. The woman exhaled sharply through her nose, a small sound that carried an obvious message. Annoyance. A few nearby passengers noticed. One man lowered his phone slightly, pretending to check something else while actually watching. A woman across the aisle paused mid-sip of her drink, her eyes flicking between the standing woman and Keanu. The cabin's quiet became a little more fragile, like a glass about to crack. The woman shifted her suitcase handle as if ready to claim territory. She leaned slightly forward, her eyes locked on Keanu. Her voice was not loud yet, but it had an edge, the kind of tone that signals a confrontation is coming. Keanu sat still, calm as ever, the soft cabin light reflecting on his face. He looked like someone who had been through far louder storms than this, and who had learned not to react to every wave. He waited, giving the woman space to speak without fear and without anger. Around them, the first-class cabin continued to fill. People kept placing bags in overhead bins. The flight attendants continued greeting passengers. But a small bubble of tension formed around Keanu's row, and those closest to it could feel the change, like a cold draft slipping into a warm room. The woman opened her mouth as if ready to say something sharp. The moment hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable, while Keanu's calm presence stayed steady, unmoving. Everything had felt normal just minutes before. Now it felt like the beginning of a scene nobody wanted to witness, but everyone would remember. The woman didn't bother with hello or even a polite excuse me. She leaned in a little, her perfume sharp and expensive, and her voice cut through the soft first-class quiet like a knife. "This is first class," she said, loud enough for people 2 rows away to hear. "You're in the wrong place." A few heads turned instantly. Keanu lifted his eyes slowly, not startled, just attentive, like he was listening to someone who had asked a normal question. He looked at her face, then at the seat number, then back at her. His voice stayed calm and respectful. "I believe this is my seat, ma'am." He didn't sound annoyed. He didn't sound defensive. He sounded like someone explaining something simple, but the woman's expression tightened like she had been insulted by his calmness. She held her boarding pass up in front of his face as if it were proof that she was right, and she waved it in a small, impatient motion. "No, no, it's not," she snapped. "People like you don't sit here. Look at you." Her eyes moved over his jacket and shirt with a kind of disgust, as if his clothes were something dirty that had somehow entered her perfect space. Keanu sat back slightly, giving her room, and he glanced at her ticket without reaching for it. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "But I'm pretty sure," she cut him off immediately, her voice rising. "Pretty sure you're pretty sure," she mocked. "That's the problem with people who try to sneak into places they don't belong. You think being quiet will make no one notice?" Her words were sharp and full of confidence, like she was enjoying the attention. The cabin was quiet now in a different way, not peaceful, but tense because everyone could hear her. A man across the aisle slowly lowered his laptop screen, pretending to stretch, but he was watching. A woman nearby stopped flipping through a magazine and stared over the top edge. Even the flight attendant at the front paused for a moment, her smile fading as she noticed the growing noise. Keanu remained still. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look angry. He looked patient, like he was trying to understand why this woman needed to fight. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," he said, still calm. "If there's a mistake, we can check with the crew." The woman laughed, a short, harsh laugh that didn't match the elegant setting at all. "Check with the crew? Of course, you want to check with the crew. You want to waste everyone's time." Then she leaned closer, lowering her voice just a little, but still loud enough for the people near them to hear. "Listen, I paid for first class. I don't care how you got in here. Maybe you used points. Maybe you got some cheap upgrade. Maybe you're somebody's assistant. I don't know. But you're not going to sit next to me." She pointed at the seat beside him like it already belonged to her. "Move now." Keanu looked at the seat she pointed at, then back at her. And for a moment, his eyes showed something small. Maybe surprised that a grown person could speak like that. But he didn't argue. He simply shook his head slightly, calm and steady. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't move. This is the seat I was assigned." That tiny refusal made her anger jump like a spark catching dry paper. Her face flushed. "Assigned," she repeated, dragging the word out like it tasted bad. "You don't get assigned seats like this unless you belong here." Her voice rose again. "This is unbelievable. They'll let anyone in first class now." A few passengers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Some looked away, not wanting to be involved. Others watched closely because something about the scene didn't feel right. The woman's anger wasn't only about a seat. It felt like she wanted to prove something, like she needed to show the whole cabin she had power. Kanu's calmness made her feel powerless, and that made her even more furious. She placed her hand on the armrest near him as if to claim the space, leaning in closer, so her face was only a short distance from his. "Do you know who I am?" she demanded. "Do you know what kind of people fly in first class?" Keanu didn't laugh or smile. He didn't pretend to recognize her. He kept his voice gentle. "I don't know you, ma'am, but you don't need to shout." That was the wrong thing to say to someone who wanted a fight. Her eyes widened and she practically exploded. "Don't tell me what I need," she shouted, and the quiet cabin snapped fully into attention. People stared openly now. A flight attendant at the side aisle began walking toward them faster, her expression serious. The woman pointed a finger right at Kanu's chest, close enough that it felt threatening, but not touching. "You're sitting here looking like you're going to fall asleep in a bus station. This is first class. It's for people who actually," she stopped mid-sentence, searching for the word, then spat it out. "Matter." That word hung in the air ugly and loud. A few passengers reacted immediately. One man's eyebrows lifted and he shook his head slightly like he couldn't believe what he heard. A woman across the aisle pressed her lips together tightly, clearly disgusted. But no one spoke yet because people on airplanes often avoid conflict like it's a disease. Keanu remained quiet. His eyes dropped briefly, not in shame, but in a thoughtful way, like he was choosing his response carefully. Then he looked up again and said calmly, "I'm sorry you feel that way." His voice didn't carry anger. It didn't carry pride. It sounded honest, like he truly didn't want this situation to grow. But the woman didn't want calm. She wanted victory. She wanted him to stand up so she could feel bigger. She wanted him to look embarrassed so she could feel important. She leaned closer, almost hovering over him, and her voice sharpened again. "You know what? I'm not sitting next to you," she said loudly. "I refuse. I'm calling the crew. I'm not flying with this." She glanced at his clothes again as if searching for another insult. Then she said, "This mess." Her words made several people shift again. The cabin felt smaller now, like the air had thickened. Kanu's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but as if he was holding back the natural human reaction to being disrespected. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult her back. He simply took a slow breath and looked toward the aisle where the flight attendant was approaching. The woman noticed that and straightened a little as if she was preparing to perform her complaint. She adjusted her blazer, lifted her chin, and spoke even louder, making sure the whole cabin understood she was the one in charge. Finally, she said as the attendant arrived, "This man is in the wrong seat, and honestly, he shouldn't even be in first class." The flight attendant's face stayed professional, but her eyes flicked to Keanu briefly, and something in her expression changed. Just a small pause, like recognition, like surprise. Keanu gave the attendant a polite nod. "Hello," he said quietly. The woman kept talking over him. "I want him moved," she demanded. "I want another seat. I paid for this seat. I do not want to sit next to someone who looks like he crawled in from economy." The words were so rude that even the attendant's professional smile began to fade at the edges. Still, she kept her calm tone. "Ma'am," she said, "let me check both boarding passes so we can fix this properly." The woman shoved her boarding pass forward like she was handing over evidence in court. The attendant took it, glanced at it, then looked at Keanu with a gentle request. Keanu reached into his pocket slowly, not rushed, not dramatic, and pulled out his boarding pass. He handed it over with the same calm respect he had shown from the beginning. The woman watched with a smug expression as if she was sure the attendant would suddenly announce that Keanu didn't belong there. As the attendant read the boarding pass, her eyebrows lifted slightly, and her face became even more careful and polite. She looked from the ticket to Keanu, then back again, almost as if she wanted to make sure she wasn't seeing it wrong. The woman noticed that small change and misread it as victory. "See," she said loud and sharp. "I told you he doesn't belong." The attendant took a breath, still controlled. "Ma'am," she said carefully. "This seat is assigned to him." The woman blinked, confused for half a second, then frowned hard. "What?" she snapped. "No, that's impossible. Check again." The attendant did check again, slowly, clearly, making sure there was no mistake. Then she looked up, her voice still polite, but firmer now. "I have checked, ma'am. He is in the correct seat." The woman's face twisted with anger, and she looked around as if expecting someone to support her, but the faces around her were mostly uncomfortable or disapproving. Still, she refused to back down. "So, you're just letting this happen?" she shouted. "You're letting someone like him sit here while I'm supposed to just accept it?" The attendant held her ground. "Ma'am, I'm asking you to lower your voice. We want everyone to have a comfortable flight." That only made the woman more furious because now it sounded like she was the problem and she couldn't accept that. She pointed at Keanu again. He is the problem, she insisted. Look at him. He's acting like he owns the place. He's probably enjoying this. Keanu's eyes lifted slightly, and he spoke softly, not to fight, but to end the scene. I'm not enjoying anything, he said. I just want to sit and fly like everyone else. His calm words made the woman look even worse, and she could feel it. Her anger turned into something more desperate, the need to regain control. She took a step back and spoke like she was making a final demand. Fine, then move him somewhere else. Put him in the economy. I don't care. Put me here. The attendant's face became serious. Ma'am, that is not how this works. The woman's mouth fell open, offended. Excuse me. The attendant kept her voice even. This is his seat. If you would like, I can help you find your assigned seat. And if you still feel unhappy, we can discuss it calmly. The woman's cheeks flushed red. She looked around again, but the cabin was no longer on her side. People weren't whispering about Keanu anymore. They were whispering about her. A man across the aisle murmured something to his partner, and they both shook their heads. Someone behind the woman let out a small sigh, the kind that says, "Please stop." The woman seemed to realize she was losing the audience, and that made her lash out again. This is unbelievable, she snapped, raising her voice one more time. I'm going to make a complaint. I'm going to tell the airline what kind of people you allow up here. This is disgusting. The flight attendant stayed calm, but now her professionalism carried a quiet authority. Ma'am, she said, if you continue shouting, we may have to involve the cabin manager. The word manager made the woman stiffen because it sounded like consequences, and she wasn't used to consequences. She looked at Keanu again, eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she leaned toward him as if she wanted to say something directly, something personal and cruel. Keanu didn't flinch. He simply held her gaze with a calm, steady look. Not cold, not arrogant, just steady. And in that moment, something about his calmness seemed to stop her for a second, like her anger hit a wall it couldn't climb. The flight attendant stepped slightly between them, creating space, and said, "Please return to your seat, ma'am. We are preparing for departure." The woman hesitated, breathing hard, then grabbed her suitcase handle with a tight fist. She didn't apologize. She didn't admit anything. She just muttered bitterly under her breath and stepped away, walking down the aisle with stiff shoulders as if she were the victim. As she moved, Keanu stayed in his seat, quiet as before. Only now the cabin's eyes weren't judging his clothes. They were watching his patience, his self-control, and the way he didn't fight back. Even when someone tried to humiliate him, the flight attendant handed Keanu his boarding pass back with a respectful smile, and her voice softened. "I'm sorry about that, sir," she said quietly. Keanu gave a small nod. "It's okay," he replied, and his voice was so calm it almost felt unreal. Then he turned his eyes back toward the window, taking another small sip of water, as if he were refusing to let someone else's anger steal his peace. But even though the woman had walked away, the tension didn't disappear completely. It stayed in the air like a warning. People whispered more now, not about what Keanu was wearing, but about who he might be. Because some faces in the cabin had started to look closer, started to recognize something familiar in his calm expression. A man 2 rows back leaned slightly into the aisle to get a better view. A woman across the aisle frowned thoughtfully, as if trying to match the face to a memory, and the flight attendant who had stepped in looked like she had realized something important. The cabin was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. It was the quiet of a story beginning because now something bigger was forming beneath the surface, and it was clear that the woman's humiliation attempt was not going to end the way she imagined. The cabin settled into a strange silence after the flight attendant returned Kanu's boarding pass. It wasn't the peaceful silence from earlier, the kind that first class was meant for. This silence felt tight, like everyone was holding their breath and waiting to see what would happen next. People tried to pretend they weren't watching, but their eyes kept drifting back toward Keanu's row. A businessman tapped his phone screen without really reading anything. A woman folded and unfolded the corner of a magazine page, but she couldn't stop her nervous habit. Even the soft hum of the air vent sounded louder now because the human tension underneath it made everything feel sharp. Keanu remained seated exactly as before, shoulders relaxed, gaze calm, and hands resting quietly near the armrests. He didn't act like he had won anything, and he didn't look like he wanted revenge. He simply looked like someone trying to keep the moment from becoming bigger than it needed to be. The woman, however, didn't have the same goal. She had walked away down the aisle, but she wasn't finished. She stopped at her assigned seat, 2 rows back across the aisle, and she stood there with her suitcase handle in her hand like she was gripping a weapon. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were bright with frustration. She looked around at the cabin as if she expected someone to agree with her to say, "Yes, you're right. This is unacceptable." But people didn't rush to support her. Instead, they avoided her. Iser gave her looks that were polite on the surface but disapproving underneath. That made her feel even more trapped. She wanted to be the important one. She wanted the cabin to be her audience, her proof that she mattered. And now, even though she hadn't been openly insulted by anyone, she could feel that she was the one being judged. She dropped into her seat with a stiff motion and immediately pressed the call button above her head hard like she could punish the plane with her finger. The light came on. A moment later, a different flight attendant approached, slightly older, with a calm face that suggested she had handled 100 problems just like this, and had never once let her voice shake. She leaned slightly toward the woman, keeping her tone polite. "Yes, ma'am. How may I help you?" The woman didn't lower her voice. If anything, she made it louder, as if she wanted the entire cabin to hear her complaint. "I want a different seat," she said. "I'm not sitting near that man. This airline should be ashamed. People like that should not be in first class." The attendant's eyes flicked briefly toward Keanu, then back to the woman. Her expression stayed neutral, but her voice became more careful, like she was choosing each word precisely. "Ma'am, all passengers in this cabin have valid tickets for their seats." The woman leaned back as if she couldn't believe she was hearing that. "Then you need to change it," she snapped. "Move him. Upgrade someone else. Put him in the economy. I don't care. I paid for comfort and I'm not comfortable." The attendant didn't argue. She didn't show emotion. She said quietly, "Let me get the cabin manager so we can handle this properly." Then she stepped away. The woman watched her go with a satisfied look as if she had finally pressed the right button, and now the world would rearrange itself to please her. She smoothed her blazer, lifted her chin, and glanced toward Keanu again, her eyes sharp and full of insult. Keanu didn't look back. He stayed focused on the window, letting the airport lights blur into the background, but he wasn't unaware. He could feel the heat of her attention. He could feel the cabin's eyes. He simply chose not to feed it. Within minutes, the cabin manager arrived. He was a tall man with a neat uniform and a professional posture that made him look like he belonged in a hotel lobby as much as on an airplane. His expression was polite but serious. He leaned slightly toward the woman and spoke softly, trying to lower the temperature of the situation. "Good evening, ma'am. I understand there is a concern." The woman didn't match his calm. She spoke quickly and sharply like she had been preparing this speech in her head. "Yes, there is a concern," she said, emphasizing the word concern like it was a polite cover for anger. "I am being forced to sit near someone who clearly does not belong here." He looks like he just came from the street. This is first class. It's supposed to be. She paused, searching for the right word, then snapped it out. Exclusive. The cabin manager didn't react to her insult. He nodded slightly as if he was listening to a normal complaint about a broken seat. I understand, he said. May I ask which passenger you're referring to? The woman pointed dramatically down the aisle, her finger stiff. Him? That man? Her voice was loud enough that Kanu's row could hear it clearly. A few passengers winced at her tone. A man near the front let out a soft breath through his nose like he was annoyed. Woman across the aisle looked down at her hands, uncomfortable. The cabin manager followed the direction of her finger and his eyes landed on Keanu. For half a second, his expression changed. Just a small pause, just a flicker of recognition. Then his face returned to professional calm. He turned back to the woman with the same polite tone. Ma'am, he said, that passenger has a valid first-class seat and he is seated correctly. The woman's mouth fell open. That's not the point. She snapped. The point is he shouldn't be here. This makes the cabin uncomfortable. I don't care what your computer says. I can't sit near someone like that. She said the words like she was talking about a stain that needed to be removed. Several passengers heard it clearly, and now the mood in the cabin shifted again. Not just tension, but something heavier, disgust. People weren't just uncomfortable anymore. Some were angry at her, even if they didn't speak. You could see it in the way they looked at her and then quickly looked away. Kanu sat quietly, still not making eye contact, still not joining the drama. The cabin manager kept his voice soft but firm. Ma'am, we cannot move another passenger simply because you don't like how they look. If you would like to change seats, I can see if there is an available seat elsewhere. The woman's eyes narrowed. So, you're punishing me? She said, I paid for this seat. The cabin manager nodded again, calm. I understand. Let me check the seating chart. He stepped aside and pulled out a small device, tapping the screen with practice speed. The woman watched him like she expected him to magically create an empty seat. Next to a quiet, wealthy-looking passenger who would worship her presence, but first class was almost full. The cabin manager frowned slightly as he looked. Ma'am, he said. At the moment there are no open seats in first class. The woman's face turned red again. Then you need to create one, she snapped. Move someone. Put him somewhere else. She pointed again toward Keanu. He doesn't deserve it. I do. The cabin manager's tone became firmer, though he still didn't raise his voice. Ma'am, this is your final warning. You need to lower your voice and speak respectfully. If you continue to disrupt the cabin, we may have to return to the gate and involve ground staff. The word warning hit her pride like a slap. She wasn't used to being warned. She was used to being obeyed. She stiffened in her seat, eyes wide with offended disbelief. Are you threatening me? She demanded. Because I'm asking for basic standards. The cabin manager looked at her calmly. I'm asking you to follow our policies and maintain a respectful environment for all passengers. His voice was steady, and that steadiness made her feel small. She hated that feeling. She looked around again, searching for support, but now the cabin's faces were more openly disapproving. Even people who hated conflict were starting to show it in their expressions. The woman leaned forward and spoke in a harsh whisper that was still loud enough to carry. This airline is ridiculous. She said, you let people like him sit in first-class SS and then you tell me to be respectful. He should be grateful I'm even speaking to him. Her words were ugly and they fell into the cabin like dirt. A passenger 2 seats away from her. A middle-aged man with kind eyes finally couldn't stay silent. He didn't raise his voice, but he spoke clearly enough to be Heard. Ma'am, he said, he's not doing anything to you. You're the one causing the problem. The woman's head snapped toward him like a whip. Excuse me, she hissed. The man held his gaze calm. You're shouting. You're insulting someone who's just sitting quietly. It's not right. The woman looked shocked, like she couldn't believe a stranger dared to speak to her that way. Her eyes widened with anger, but before she could attack him, another voice joined in, soft female from across the aisle. He's been polite the whole time, the woman said. Please stop. It wasn't loud, but it was firm. And when two people spoke up, it made it easier for others to stop pretending. The cabin manager stepped slightly between the woman and the passengers who had spoken, protecting the peace. Thank you, he said quietly, then turned back to the woman. Ma'am, we will not tolerate harassment of any passenger. If you cannot calm down, we will have to take further action. The woman's breathing became heavy. She looked down the aisle again at Keanu as if she wanted him to respond, to fight, to give her something to point at and say, "See, he's rude." But Keanu didn't. He remained quiet, his face calm, his posture relaxed. He gave her nothing. And that calmness was like a mirror showing everyone the truth. The problem wasn't him. The problem was her. The woman's pride couldn't handle it. She stood up suddenly, forcing her suitcase sideways into the aisle. This is unbelievable, she said loudly. I'm not sitting down until he's moved. The cabin manager's face remained controlled, but his eyes hardened slightly. Ma'am, he said, please sit down. She lifted her chin. No. The cabin manager turned his head slightly and signaled to a nearby flight attendant. The attendant stepped closer, already understanding. The woman noticed, and her voice rose again. What? Heard. Ma'am, he said, he's not doing anything to you. You're the one causing the problem. The woman's head snapped toward him like a whip. Excuse me, she hissed. The man held his gaze calm. You're shouting. You're insulting someone who's just sitting quietly. It's not right. The woman looked shocked, like she couldn't believe a stranger dared to speak to her that way. Her eyes widened with anger, but before she could attack him, another voice joined in, soft female from across the aisle. He's been polite the whole time, the woman said. Please stop. It wasn't loud, but it was firm. And when two people spoke up, it made it easier for others to stop pretending. The cabin manager stepped slightly between the woman and the passengers who had spoken, protecting the peace. Thank you, he said quietly, then turned back to the woman. Ma'am, we will not tolerate harassment of any passenger. If you cannot calm down, we will have to take further action. The woman's breathing became heavy. She looked down the aisle again at Keanu as if she wanted him to respond, to fight, to give her something to point at and say, "See, he's rude." But Keanu didn't. He remained quiet, his face calm, his posture relaxed. He gave her nothing. And that calmness was like a mirror showing everyone the truth. The problem wasn't him. The problem was her. The woman's pride couldn't handle it. She stood up suddenly, forcing her suitcase sideways into the aisle. This is unbelievable, she said loudly. I'm not sitting down until he's moved. The cabin manager's face remained controlled, but his eyes hardened slightly. Ma'am, he said, please sit down. She lifted her chin. No. The cabin manager turned his head slightly and signaled to a nearby flight attendant. The attendant stepped closer, already understanding. The woman noticed, and her voice rose again. What are you doing? Are you trying to embarrass me? The cabin manager's voice stayed calm. You are embarrassing yourself, he said, not cruelly, but simply as a statement of fact. The words shocked her. For a moment, she froze as if her brain couldn't process that someone had spoken to her honestly. In that moment of stillness, Keanu finally turned his head slightly, not to argue, not to accuse, just to look. His eyes met the cabin manager's briefly, then drifted toward the woman. His face was calm, but there was something clear in his expression now. Quiet disappointment, not anger, not fear, just a sad understanding of how far some people will go to feel important. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than her shouting. The cabin manager made a quiet decision. He leaned toward the woman and spoke low enough that only she and the nearby crew could hear, but the firmness in his tone carried. "Ma'am, you have two choices. You may sit down and remain respectful for the rest of the flight, or we will return to the gate 8 and you will be removed." Woman's eyes widened. Removed? She whispered as if the word was too extreme for her reality. The cabin manager nodded. Yes. The woman's mouth opened then closed. Her hands tightened around her suitcase handle. She looked around again and now she could see it clearly. People were not on her side. They were watching her like she was the problem they wished would disappear. She swallowed, her face still red, and slowly, unwillingly, she lowered herself back into her seat. The cabin manager didn't relax yet. "Thank you," he said calmly. "Now, I will ask you to remain quiet." The woman's lips trembled with rage, but she didn't shout. She sat there stiffly, staring forward as if she could burn a hole through the cabin wall with her eyes. The cabin manager nodded to the crew and stepped away, moving down the aisle toward the front. The attendants returned to their normal tasks, but the cabin didn't return to normal. The story had spread through the space like smoke. People whispered now, not hiding it as much. Some leaned toward their partners to ask, "Is that really him?" Others stared at Keanu more openly now because recognition was forming in their minds. The man's calm face, the familiar eyes, the quiet posture, it started to click. A flight attendant approached Keanu's row again, softer, now careful. "Sir," she said quietly, leaning down slightly so she didn't draw attention. "Are you all right?" Keanu gave a small nod. "I'm fine," he said gently. "Thank you." The attendant hesitated, then offered a quiet apology. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that." Keanu's expression remained calm. "It happens," he said simply. And those two words said a lot. They suggested he had experienced this kind of judgment before, not because he belonged in first class, but because people often judged him without knowing him. As the plane prepared for departure, the seatbelt sign chimed softly. The cabin manager's voice came over the speaker. Standard instructions, calm and professional. People buckled their seatbelts. Bags were secured. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. The moment should have faded into the routine of travel. But it didn't, because the woman's anger was still alive in her seat. And the cabin's attention was still quietly centered on Keanu. The woman sat rigidly, eyes forward, jaw tight. She didn't look at him again, but everyone could feel her bitterness like heat from a stove. Keanu turned back to the window. Outside, the plane began to move slowly away from the gate. Airport lights glided past like stars on the ground. The motion should have felt normal, but for the passengers in first class, it felt like they were carrying an unfinished story into the sky. The woman had been forced to sit down, but she hadn't been humbled yet. She hadn't truly understood what she had done. Inu sitting quietly in his simple clothes had become the calm center of a storm that wasn't done forming. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the woman's phone buzzed with a message. She glanced down at it and smirked slightly as if she had an idea. She typed quickly, her fingers moving with sharp purpose. She looked up briefly, eyes flicking toward Keanu, then back to her phone. Whatever she was doing, it wasn't peaceful. It's planning. And that small detail, her secret smile, her quick typing was the sign that this conflict wasn't over. Not yet. High above them, the cockpit crew prepared for takeoff. They didn't know everything happening in the cabin, but they could sense a disturbance through the crew's reports. The cabin manager had already sent a brief update forward, the kind of message that told the cockpit something important had happened. And as the plane lined up on the runway, ready to lift into the night, the tension in first class remained quiet but alive, waiting for the moment that would finally break it. Because sometimes the real turning point in a story doesn't happen when someone shouts. It happens when someone with authority speaks. And soon the entire plane would hear that voice. The plane rolled slowly toward the runway and the lights outside the window moved like a quiet river of gold. Inside first class, the cabin was buckled in and pretending to return to normal, but the air still felt tight. People looked forward as if nothing had happened. Yet their eyes kept drifting as like magnets pulled them toward the same place. The woman sat stiff in her seat, shoulders locked, jaw tight, her hands resting on her lap like she was forcing herself to stay still. Every few seconds, she glanced around, checking who was watching, who was whispering, who might be judging her. She hated the feeling of being observed. She hated even more that she couldn't control it. A moment earlier, she had wanted attention. Now that she had it, she wanted it to disappear. Keanu sat in his seat near the window, his seatbelt fastened, his posture steady. He looked out at the runway lights and breath as if the plane was a calm place again. But calm is not always the same as safe. Sometimes calm is just the quiet before the next wave. The woman's phone buzzed again. She tilted the screen toward herself and typed quickly, her fingers sharp and angry. Her eyes flicked toward Keanu's row, then back to her phone like she was building a story in her head and writing it down before the truth could ruin it. She didn't smile like a happy person. It was a small, tense smile, the kind someone makes when they believe they're about to win. She sent a message, then another. Then she slipped her phone down and stared forward again, pretending she was simply waiting for takeoff like everyone else. But her body language gave her away. She kept shifting. She kept tightening her grip on the armrest. She was carrying a storm in her chest, and she didn't know how to let it go. A few rows ahead, the cabin manager leaned toward a flight attendant and spoke quietly. His tone was controlled, but the attendant's face showed that the situation was being taken seriously. She nodded and moved toward the forward galley, lifting a phone mounted on the wall. She spoke softly into it, eyes focused, posture professional. She wasn't gossiping, she was reporting. The woman saw it and narrowed her eyes. She didn't know exactly what was happening, but she sensed that the crew was not on her side. That made her feel threatened, and when she felt threatened, she attacked. It wasn't enough for her to sit quietly. She needed to regain the feeling of power. The feeling that she could still control the narrative. As the plane paused near the runway, waiting for clearance, the woman suddenly unbuckled her belt and stood up again. A few passengers gasped softly, not loud, but startled because everyone knew you weren't supposed to stand up at this time. The seatbelt sign was still on. The cabin manager turned his head immediately. A flight attendant took one step forward, ready to stop her. The woman lifted her hand in a sharp gesture, like she was brushing away a fly. "I need to speak to someone," she said loudly. "This is ridiculous. I'm not going to sit here as if nothing happened." Her voice was filled with anger, but also something else now, panic, because she could feel control slipping away. She looked down the aisle at Keanu, and her eyes carried a cruel determination. "This man should not be here," she said again louder than before. "I don't care what ticket he has. This is first class. This is supposed to be for respectable people." A few passengers reacted openly now. A man muttered, "Oh, come on," under his breath. A woman shook her head and looked away with disgust. Someone whispered, "She's still going." The woman heard the whispers and turned her head sharply, scanning the cabin like she wanted to catch the person who dared to judge her. "What?" she snapped. "You're all just going to sit there and pretend this is normal?" Her voice rose as if she needed to climb higher to stay above the shame. "This airline should be ashamed," she shouted. The cabin manager moved quickly but calmly, stepping into the aisle. "Ma'am," he said firmly. "Please sit down immediately. The seatbelt sign is on. You are not allowed to stand during a taxi." The woman glared at him. "I don't care," she snapped. "I paid for this flight. I will stand if I want to." The cabin manager's expression tightened. "Ma'am," he repeated. "Sit down." His voice didn't rise, but the firmness in it was stronger than shouting. The woman's face twisted as if she couldn't believe he was speaking to her like that. "You're treating me like a criminal," she hissed. "All because I don't want to sit next to some. She searched again for an insult that would hurt more, some poor-looking stranger. Keanu remained seated. He didn't react. He didn't glance toward her to challenge her. He kept his eyes calm and forward. But now, because she was standing and shouting again, she forced the whole cabin into the scene. Keanu's calmness was still there, but the woman's volume was bigger, and it was reaching the part of the plane it hadn't reached before. The crew in the back would hear it. The passengers behind the curtain would hear it, and the cockpit through the crew's communication would hear it, too. A flight attendant stepped closer, her voice gentle, but warning, "Ma'am, please sit down. If you do not comply, we may have to stop the aircraft." The woman laughed harshly. "Stop the aircraft?" she repeated. "For what?" "For speaking the truth," she pointed down the aisle again. "That man is the problem." The flight attendant's face became serious. "No, ma'am," she said quietly. "Your behavior is the problem." That simple sentence landed like a slap. The woman's eyes widened. "How dare you?" she whispered, then shouted. "How dare you?" Her voice echoed in the cabin. The cabin manager made a quick gesture to another attendant and the attendant moved toward the forward phone again. This time the woman saw it clearly. She saw the seriousness. She saw the quiet teamwork. She realized something was about to happen that she could not control. Her pride refused to sit down, but her fear started to tug at her. She stood there for another moment, breathing hard, then slowly lowered herself back into her seat like she was doing it against her will. She buckled in again with sharp angry motions. The seatbelt clicked loudly like the final sound of a lost battle. For a moment there was quiet, not comfort quiet. People stared forward again. The cabin manager returned to the front with measured steps. Keanu breathed out slowly and looked out the window again as if he was trying to keep the peace inside his own mind. But the woman was still burning. Even sitting down, she wasn't calm. She leaned toward the passenger next to her and whispered something fast and bitter. The passenger didn't respond, only stared forward. The woman huffed, offended that even a stranger wouldn't join her side. She pulled out her phone again and typed quickly, her face twisted like she was writing a complaint that would ruin someone's day. Then she snapped the phone screen off and held it tightly. In the cockpit, the pilots were preparing for takeoff, but they had been informed that there had been a serious disturbance in first class. Pilots don't usually make personal announcements about cabin disputes. They focus on safety, weather, and flight procedures, but sometimes a situation affects the whole aircraft. Sometimes the best way to protect the atmosphere on board is to remind everyone that respect and order are not optional. The captain listened to a brief report from the cabin manager through the intercom system. His response was calm but firm. He understood something important. If one person believes they can harass another person freely, the entire cabin becomes unsafe. Not physically unsafe but emotionally unsafe, and that can lead to bigger problems. The captain made a decision. A soft chime sounded through the cabin speakers, heads lifted. The announcement tone always grabs attention. The woman froze slightly. Keanu's eyes shifted from the window to the front, but his face remained calm. People across the first class stopped fidgeting. Even the whispers ended. For a moment, the entire aircraft felt like it was holding a single breath. Then the pilot's voice came through, warm and steady, the kind of voice people trust when they're thousands of feet in the air. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "welcome aboard. This is your captain speaking." The voice carried the normal confidence of a professional, but there was also something else. Deliberate care. "We're expecting a smooth flight today. The weather along our route looks good, and we should be in the air shortly." There was a small pause. People expected him to continue with routine instructions. But instead, his tone shifted slightly, not angry, but purposeful. "Before we depart," he said, "I want to remind everyone of something important. We're sharing this aircraft. We're sharing this space. And our crew is here to keep everyone safe and comfortable." Another pause, just long enough to make the words sink in. "We treat each other with respect. We do not harass anyone. We do not insult anyone, no matter what seat you are in." A quiet ripple moved through the cabin. It wasn't loud, but you could feel it. Some passengers exchanged quick looks like, "Did he really just say that?" The woman's face turned a shade paler. Her eyes darted left and right. She could feel the announcement like a spotlight turning toward her, even though the pilot never said her name. That was the power of it. Everyone knew why he was saying it. Everyone knew who it was for. The pilot continued, his voice still steady. "If there is an issue, our crew will handle it. But if anyone refuses to follow crew instructions, or if anyone continues to disrupt the cabin, we will return to the gate. That will cause delays for everyone." His tone remained calm, but the warning was clear. "We appreciate your cooperation. We appreciate your kindness. Let's have a good flight." The speakers clicked off. For a second, there was complete silence. Real silence. The kind that makes you hear the hum of the engines and the soft breathing of people around you. Then life returned in small movements. A passenger shifted in their seat. Another cleared their throat. Someone exhaled slowly. But the mood had changed. The pilot's announcement didn't just calm the cabin. It reset it. It made the invisible rules visible again. It reminded everyone that money doesn't buy the right to humiliate another human being. The woman stared forward, frozen, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her hands tightened on her phone, but she didn't type now. She didn't even look down. She looked like someone who had been publicly corrected without anyone calling her name. That kind of correction is hard to fight. She couldn't argue with the captain. She couldn't shout back at the speakers. She couldn't demand the plane move someone else now. She had been boxed in by authority and by the eyes of everyone around her. Across the aisle, a man who had been watching leaned slightly toward his partner and whispered, "Good." His partner nodded, her eyes still fixed forward. A woman near the front glanced toward Keanu's row with a look of quiet respect. Someone else smiled faintly, the kind of smile that says, "Finally, someone did the right thing." Keanu didn't react to the attention. He didn't look around to enjoy the moment. He didn't smirk. He simply rested back in his seat, calm and quiet like he had been the entire time. His peace didn't depend on winning. It depended on refusing to become the same kind of person who tried to hurt him. The plane began to roll forward again, lining up for takeoff. The runway lights stretched ahead like a long white path into the dark. As the aircraft turned into position, the engines grew louder, building power. The cabin pressed back gently as acceleration began. People leaned into their seats, hands resting on armrests, eyes forward. The moment of takeoff has a way of making humans remember they are not in control. No matter how rich someone is, no matter what seat they have, the sky treats everyone the same. As the plane lifted, the cabin dipped slightly and then the ground fell away. The city lights outside became a sparkling map. The woman swallowed and gripped her armrests tightly, her confidence reduced by gravity, air pressure, and reality. Keanu remained steady, looking out the window again. The world below looked peaceful from up here. Tiny lights, quiet patterns, everything's far away. It was almost ironic. Down on the ground, the woman's pride had felt huge. Up in the air, it was small. When the seatbelt sign turned off a few minutes later, the cabin slowly returned to motion. People unbuckled, stretched, and adjusted their blankets. But the mood stayed different. The woman kept her head forward, refusing to look toward Keanu again. She wasn't ready to apologize. Her pride wouldn't allow it. But she was forced into silence. And silence in this case was the best thing she could offer. A flight attendant approached Keanu again with a quiet smile. "Would you like anything, sir?" she asked softly. Keanu returned a gentle smile. "Just water, thank you," she nodded and brought it quickly. When she handed it to him, her voice lowered. "I'm sorry for what happened," she said again. Keanu looked at her with calm eyes. "Thank you," he replied. And he meant it. Not dramatic, not emotional, just sincere. Then he took the glass and placed it carefully on the tray like he was placing Kay back into the world, one small action at a time. Across the aisle, a younger passenger, maybe in his 20s, kept glancing at Keanu as if he was trying to confirm what he already suspected. Leaned toward his phone and quietly searched. A few seconds later, his eyes widened. He showed the screen to the person next to him, and the person's eyebrows shot up. They both glanced back at Keanu, then quickly looked away, not wanting to be rude, but their reaction spread. Another passenger noticed their whispers and leaned in. Someone else checked, too. Within minutes, a quiet understanding moved through first class like a soft wave. The man in the simple clothes wasn't just some random traveler. It was Keanu Reeves, and the woman had tried to humiliate him. Because she thought he was poor. That knowledge didn't make Keanu act. It made everyone else see the moment differently. Some looked ashamed that they had judged him earlier. Others looked angry at the woman all over again. A few passengers seemed inspired by how calmly he had handled it, but Keanu didn't respond to any of it. He remained himself, quiet, respectful, uninterested in drama. The woman, however, started to sense that something was shifting behind her. She noticed the whispers. She noticed the glances. She noticed the tiny changes in posture around her, like people were turning away from her energy. She looked down at her phone again and opened the message she had written earlier. Her eyes moved across the words, and something in her expression changed, not into kindness, but into doubt. For the first time, she seemed to wonder if she had made a mistake bigger than pride. She seemed to wonder if this story might follow her off the plane. She leaned back, swallowing, and stared at the seat in front of her. The cabin lights were dimmer now, like the plane was trying to encourage peace. The engines hummed steadily. A flight attendant rolled a cart quietly down the aisle, offering snacks. Normal flight life resumed, but for the woman, nothing felt normal. The captain's announcement had placed a boundary around her behavior. The cabin's reaction had placed a mirror in front of her. And the whispers about who Keanu really was. Those whispers were building something she couldn't stop. Regret. Still, regret doesn't always arrive as an apology. Sometimes it arrives as fear of consequences. The woman's eyes flicked toward